Hey folks, so this advert for Pharaoh Total War popped up on my timeline, and of course I am a long time Total War fan. I mean, I've been playing Total War for about 23 years now. Big fan of Rome 2, Medieval 2, played Empire, Warhammer Total War. I never played Shogun, but I've played a couple of the other ones, and Attila and things like that. And Kingdoms of Britannia, like all I've played loads of them, right? I've been playing for decades, and you've probably seen the playthroughs I've put on this channel and on my Twitch. And I'm not actually terribly concerned about what I'm hearing about Pharaoh Total War, because normally I'm a bit cynical about these things these days, because there's a lot that has gone wrong with the Total War franchise, and it frustrates me because it didn't need to go wrong. Really, what needed to happen is the base substructure should have been essentially what Rome was, right? Because Rome was perfectly fine, and just improvements made instead of a complete regeneration of the entire thing. I mean, when Rome 2 first came out, it took a long time for Rome 2 to really be a playable game. I mean, if anyone remembers the blobs, when a unit would contact another unit, it would just lose all formation, and so you literally end up just there was a game where it's literally just water, blobs of water that are eating each other, and it would be like that, right? And it was gross and unplayable, and it took many years, and it took the modding community a long time to produce mods that could bring it to the sort of level that Medieval 2 is at, right? But to be fair, Rome 2 I find pretty playable, pretty enjoyable now. So that's good. It only took a decade, but that's fine. But about 8 years, but it's fine. And I'm happy with it, right? Relatively speaking. And so I thought I'm just going to read from this because they're advertising a few specific features. So this is an advert that's specifically to someone like me. And I just want to say why I'm not terribly perturbed by what I'm reading in here, right? Now, Pharaoh Total War is going to be set around the sort of time of the Iliad, actually, because I'm nurturing a theory that, in fact, the Sea Peoples, I think it was Ramses III, who finally defeated the Sea Peoples. I should have checked that, really. But he famously said there was a conspiracy in their isles. And if you read the Iliad, you realise, well, Agamemnon is the sort of overlord of all the Greeks, but he's not like a divine king or something. There is some sort of negotiation that has happened to bring all of the Greeks onto the same side, and this is why Achilles can just be like, I'm not fighting, my Myrmidons aren't fighting, and you can go and fight without me, and you're going to lose, and the Trojans are going to beat you. Which is basically what happens until, of course, Achilles is persuaded by one of the gods to go out and fight because Patroclus gets killed. Anyway, the point being, there is some sort of hierarchical coalition going on in the Greek forces, which you could summarize in a line with a conspiracy in their isles. And there are other things like Ramses resettles the conquered sea people in what is now Palestine, because they were called the Peliset, or one of those tribes was called the Peliset. And archaeology shows that actually there are Mycenaean Greek artifacts there, so it could well have been these people brought them or made them there in the custom of their own homeland and whatnot. And where else are they going to have come from? It's just most likely there's this big collection of islands right there. It's not very far away, but it's far enough to be a distant land in this time period. And they sail their ships along the coast. And when you look at the Bronze Age collapse, basically it's just everything around the Eastern Mediterranean gets nuked until it comes to Egypt, and Egypt is the only major power of the time that actually defeats them. And this brings on the Bronze Age collapse, where you've got a massive collapse of the economy, trade routes and whatnot are destroyed, and civilization regresses, because history is not just linear. Civilization regresses, and you get the Greek Dark Ages, where literally people forget how to read and write. And so this is why the ancient Greeks have a different script to the Mycenaean Greeks, Linear A and Linear B. And I believe that Linear A still hasn't been translated, actually. So, I mean, I may be wrong. I haven't been keeping up with the news on breaking news on translations of Linear A or anything. It was just a few years ago when I was reading about it. That was the state of play. So the point is, this is an exciting time period. Right? This is a good time period to set a Total War game in. And now I have been begging for a Syria Total War for many years now, privately in my head. I've probably mentioned it on streams or something, but like I would love an Assyria Total War set around 9 or 800 BC. Right? That would be ideal because you have a lot of stuff going on in the ancient Near East. Egypt is a power. You have Mitanni or whoever it is. You've got the Elamites. You've got various the Medes and the Persians, or the tribes that will become the Medes and the Persians. You've got a lot of stuff going on. You've got Babylon, obviously, and so you've got a really interesting chessboard basically for pieces to move on. And the Assyrians, like as a Total War game, thematically, the Assyrians are a Total War faction, as in that's what they did all day, every single year, all over the Middle East. All they wanted to do is fight, and their empire was literally just maintained by terror. Right? That's how this worked. We have the biggest and best army, and we are going to subjugate you, and that's the legitimacy on which our empire is founded. So it's literally the heart of Total War could be found in Assyria, and also the Assyrian army had lots of different units. Like we have the reliefs of the Assyrian army where it's like literally different kinds of units, like in a Total War game, like the faction, the unit cards. It's actually surprising. I mean, I'm sure Creative Assembly says, well, are Assyria famous enough? It's like, dude, you can make them famous enough. But anyway, so setting it in about 1300 BC or 1200 BC, whatever, that's still fine because there are still great powers. There are still a lot of warfare at this time, obviously, and there's a lot going on, and so this is a good time period, right? This is interesting and novel, right? And I never played Troy Total War, actually, because it's very small, and it had mythical things in, and I didn't really want mythical Total War, which is probably one of the reasons I didn't enjoy Warhammer Total War, actually, but that just felt very, very video gamey. But the time period is good, and it's novel, like I said, apart from the Troy Total War, which I don't think was a massive hit or something. I don't hear anyone talking about it. Having like a large map of the Middle East, including like the Greek islands over to like, the very outreaches of Persia or perhaps the beginning of India, that's a good world map. There's a lot going on there. And so good time period, interesting characters, and you've got notable characters as well. We, of course, have a bunch of named characters from this time period, and we know the sorts of things that they were talking about. There was a series of letters called the Amarna letters from about this time period that were discovered, talking about the daily life and the people involved in what was happening in the politics. You get, like, diplomatic letters have been sent, and various communiques have been put back and forth, so send troops here, we are being attacked, why won't you help us, things like this. And it's all really interesting, and that's a good start. Now I don't know what the base building is going to be like, the city building in Pharaoh is going to be like, but cities were fairly complex actually in this time. Generally they worked on what was called a palace economy, so like the palace was the main economic hub of everything, and vast amounts of goods would come into the palace and then be distributed around the empire or around like the classes of people or whatever. There was a lot going on, and there were lots of different professions, lots that you could incorporate. I mean, I was kind of pissed off with Rome Total War 2's building system, right? There was no need to simplify it. That wasn't fun. In Rome and Medieval, it was fun to, every couple of turns, build a new building that did something. And so, in a few turns, the city that in 20 turns or whatever, the city that you'd been building up felt built up. It had lots of things in it. It did lots of stuff. It made lots of money. You improve the quality of life, blah, blah, improve culture. And if it was sacked and razed, right, the city actually went down in size. It actually went down in quality, right? You couldn't just, I'll just rebuild that, I'll just rebuild that. It wasn't that easy. And the city would produce a vast amount less money and would be capable of producing less advanced resources, troops and resources and stuff like this. And so it actually made a difference to the quality of your empire. If you went around just sacking and destroying a bunch of cities you had no intention of holding because they were just, you were on a campaign, and then you went back, that area actually settled for a while, right? That faction, even if you couldn't wipe them out, they weren't, or even if you weren't going to be able to hold it, you would at least be able to ruin the economy of the area. So the people who took it would get far fewer benefits out of it, or that faction would be like, just generating spearmen to throw at you now. So it wasn't like something, it wasn't like epic knights or Roman legionaries or whatever it is, right? So you were able to actually impact the enemy faction without destroying them outright, and that felt good. That's a good feeling in the game, and you'd make loads of money doing this, obviously, which doubtless is why the sea peoples, the Danaans or the Aegeans, whatever you want to call them, were doing it. They were going around sacking the hell out of stuff because they were making huge amounts of money. I mean, Achilles even says at one point, I've sacked 12 cities. Okay, well, where were these 12 cities? Obviously, they're going to be along the Aegean coast. Anyway, so the building was good, right? Building, 4 buildings? Or, I mean, you start with like 2 or 3 buildings. So you'll end up building 2 buildings in each city in Rome 2. That's not fun. That's really boring. It becomes okay, I'll build a temple that will give my guys +1 experience. Oh, brilliant. That was literally all I've done in this entire province for like 20 turns. This is insanely boring. It's really lazy, and I don't know why they included this, right? And so that's bad. If Pharaoh returns to, and again, I've seen very little real information about Pharaoh at this point, but if Pharaoh returns to a kind of Rome-style building system where you actually get to build things, that would be wonderful, right? And so let's go on to this advert that we've seen, right? So it's set during the Bronze Age collapse, right? Pharaoh Menetaf has just died. Okay, that's fine. And so you're going to have Upper and Lower Egypt probably as 2 separate factions. Hopefully you've got Nubia or Kish or whatever they call it. You've got a lot going on. I don't know how big the map's going to be. Hopefully it's a big map. But of course they say several factions of vying for supremacy. Each of their own different units, different starting locations. Yeah. Well, we assumed they'd have different starting locations, obviously. Tell us why those starting locations are interesting. Distinct challenge levels, that's fine. Right. And so you've got the young prodigy Ramses, blah, 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 and then whichever faction succeeds in painting the map their colour, they'll need to master some new battle mechanics in this game. Okay, great. The pace of battle has been deliberately slowed to show you how your tactical decisions play out. Now, this, to someone who doesn't play Total War, isn't a long-time player, might be like, why would I want that? It's like, because that actually is what makes the battles interesting and gets you invested in them, right? One of the main complaints about Rome Total War 2 that I still have to this day is that the battles take about 10 minutes. Now, you might be like, well, why would I want to spend all day in a battle? It's because a battle is meant to be momentous, right? Because theoretically, at least through history, a pitched battle is you risking almost everything. Right? You probably only have one army, and the quality of the army is dependent entirely on the things that the army has done. Right? In real life, you actually don't just get to churn out unit after unit of stock soldiers who are at 15 armor and 25 experience, or whatever. You don't actually get to do that. In real life, the army grows as an organic unit, as a kind of mobile, predatory city, and the experience of the people in it are what gives it its effectiveness. And so they know how to move and when to move and things like that, right? And so pitched battles were big deals. Right? Most generals didn't fight more than a handful in their entire careers. Some generals would fight 30. And that's a huge number, right? So because you are risking everything in the pitched battle. Because if it starts going against you, then you could lose your entire army, and that's absolutely terrible, right? So to have the battles more engaging, make them more investing, make you be more worried and spend a bit more time about them, that's totally fine. Because in Rome 1, you would spend more time on a battle, and therefore your tactics and your positioning would be much more important, right? And they've added some new key tactics, apparently, which are really good, right? So they say there are new wrinkles to those tactics too. Unit weight, terrain, and an exhaustion system that now play key roles in outcomes. So they had unit weight and exhaustion and terrain as factors in previous Total Wars, but to be honest with you, I've always been disappointed with how underwhelming they seem to be. Like, even when a unit is exhausted, they can still charge across the map. they still run around. They just run around a bit slower. And it's like, okay, you know, and I'm sure it does reduce their stats somewhat, but it was never very noticeable, frankly. And it would be nice for it to be noticeable, because an exhausted unit that really should be punished against a fresh one, right? That was the point of having reserves. You would send fresh units to the front to plug holes, and they would be effective, right? And terrain as well. Again, having the high ground would be better for morale, and you'd have some small bonus, but that's really not the be all and end of it, right? So we'll get into this bit, right? So the dynamic weather system is a really great idea. They've got, like, you know, storms that hamper missile unit effectiveness and spread of fire, sweltering heat that drains fatigue quicker, and things like that. And this is all totally reflective of how ancient war was. Like, the Crusaders, when they first arrived in the Middle East, were baking in their armour. I mean, the armour was fantastic, and the Middle Easterns, the Saracens, were just like, oh my god, look at these men of iron who can't seem to be stopped. But man, you know that they were suffering in their armour. And there's this a chronicle of the First Crusade written by someone on the Crusade, but we don't know who it was. And they say, just look, this is tough. You know, we're walking through deserts in mail and gambesons. I mean, I just sweat just hearing it. Like, you'd be sweating if it was just like 20 degrees outside. If it was winter, you'd probably be sweating, marching around in this stuff and fighting in this stuff. So that sounds like hell, right? And that's why having lighter armor would actually be an advantage. So you could have super heavy bronze armor like they did. If you go look up the Dendra Panoply, it's literally full plate bronze. But man, that must have been a nightmare. You're literally an oven, right? And so actually being like, well, I've got like a linen, like layered linen, linothorax, whatever they call it, instead of a giant heavy bronze. Sure, I'll probably take more damage if I get hit, but I'm not going to be exhausted. I'm going to be able to fight long after this guy has collapsed from heat exhaustion, right? That should be a big deal. Fatigue should be a big deal, you know, and resting should be a big deal. Like, bringing units back from the front to have them rest specifically should be a desirable tactic. You know, the Romans did this with their units. They would do this. They would bring units back from the front and cycle other units to the line, because your fighting effectiveness is just massively hampered when you're exhausted. And if you don't really know what I'm talking about, go to a punch bag and just start punching it as hard as you can for as long as you can, and you'll realize within a minute, if you can last that long, you are pouring with sweat. And that's you just in a t-shirt punching a punch bag, right? So that's great. The next thing is the qualitative aspects of the terrain, which are important, right? Because now the Battle of Agincourt is a great example of this. This is the prime example where the English set up on top of a hill. Okay, that's not the end of the world. The French outnumbered them like 3-1 or something, and they've got cavalry, so they can just charge up. Except it has rained, and therefore this is not just a hill. This is actually a giant sludgy mire, and so you can't, you know, if it's literally going up to the hocks of the horse or whatever, and it's goopy and it's slowing them down, then if you're getting rained on with arrows, that's actually terrible. And that's one of the reasons that the French got absolutely annihilated at Agincourt. And then if you're marching infantry up this mushed up hill that the cavalry have just mushed up and been routed off of, well, that makes you really slow and exhausted by the time you get there, right? So actually picking the location and having fortuitous weather does make all the difference in a real world battle. So it's good that they are including these things. So that's good, right? They also have unit stances, which are... This is so... This is, for me, this has been the thing that has been missing from Total War since day one. Because really, it is about the attitude and stance of the unit, what the unit is trying to achieve, that is the thing that has always been missing from Total War, and why you could never really recreate ancient battles in Total War, right? For example, the Macedonian Phalanx, or the Phalanx in general, but especially the Macedonian Phalanx, right? In every Total War game that has ever been made, and every person who plays it, the Macedonian Phalanx is to them a defensive formation. It's nothing but spears. It is a giant hedgerow of spears. It is a very offensive formation, and every account from the ancient world that we have is that the Macedonian Phalanx is terrifying. Because it is a group of people who are marching shoulder to shoulder in ranks with 20-foot-long sarissas, pikes, pushing forward, bristling like an aggressive hedgehog, and it's difficult to stand against that. This is what Mummius told us at the Battle of, I think it was Battle of Cynocephaly, right? He was like, the Macedonian Phalanx was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life, this Roman commander, because what they do is they march at you, poking and stabbing, thousands, tens of thousands of them, in literally a hedgerow of pikes, and that is really difficult to resist. It was an incredibly aggressive formation that could break enemy formations really, really easily. It was just generally difficult to attack, right? But that's not represented in Total War at all. It is in fact a defensive formation, and it's like, no, that's just wrong. That's been completely wrong for all of Total War, and it's because you can't really tell the units to just do something. You've got to tell them where to go on the map, right? No. What I want is to tell the unit to either advance, and so they slowly advance while attacking, fall back, as in keep their shields to the enemy, but move themselves backwards, or hold their ground, right? These three stances are what have been missing from Total War that prevent it from actually replicating properly an ancient battlefield. And a great example of this is the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal's great victory over the Romans isn't really possible in Rome, and I've tried to replicate it many a time. It's even a campaign battle in one of the Romes that you can do, just like, on the quick battles. And you can't really win, or at least I played it dozens of times trying to replicate this, and you just can't really do it because the engine itself doesn't represent it. Because the way the Battle of Cannae worked, and Hannibal knew what he was doing before this all played out. He had this down perfectly. He knew what the Romans had. He knew what they were going to do. So the Romans, they weren't just advance, engage with enemy, right? That's not what it was. March forward and press, right? Use the weight and the force of the Roman formation as a body to push through the enemy. Break them open, and then start devouring them. And that's what happened at Battle of Cynocephaly. The Romans managed to push into the phalanx and just start stabbing and hacking, right? And so this is what, and that it disintegrated from the inside. And that's what they were trying to break the Carthaginian lines, like they had done at the Battle of the River Trebier. But Hannibal had learned his lesson. He was like, right, instead of trying to resist the Romans, what I want is for my front line to fall back, to just give ground and allow the Romans to advance, and we will give them ground, but without breaking. And what happened? So he put his units in a sort of chevron formation. The Romans came forward, impacted it, and they just gave ground. And Hannibal was apparently right in the middle of this. Gave ground until suddenly it was an inverted chevron, and the Romans were packed in and surrounded. And then, of course, the cavalry, which had won the cavalry battle, moved around. The units on this side hadn't even moved, and so they just folded in. And suddenly you had the famous double envelopment on open ground, in plain sight, totally achieved, right? This is the most brilliant military maneuver of all time as far as I'm concerned, and it is not possible to recreate it in Rome because of the way that things just stand there. And if you want them to move, you've got to physically move them, and that ruins everything, right? If you tell them to try and move through an enemy unit, then they're not pushing the enemy unit, they're moving through it, and they get sliced up, and the enemy unit they panic and retreat, and it's like, well, that's not what I was asking for. I was asking for you to push. You know, a hoplite phalanx, when everyone's shoulder to shoulder, it's a rugby scrum, right? Every description of it is a scrum. They push and they push, and then they start, you know, people at the back like hacking with their spears and guys stabbing as much as they can. It's about weight and strength and power. It's not about just standing there stabbing each other, right? It's never been represented well in Rome before, in Total War before. And so, as they say here, you know, give ground stance lets your opponent advance on you while you're still engaging in battle and facing them. That is, I mean, I don't know how these are going to be, you know, enacted or put into practice in this game, right? But at least they understand what Rome lacked. It always needed these things. It never had these things, and so it was always lacking because of that. This is, as far as I'm concerned, as like a military history nerd and a Total War fan, I'm very enthusiastic to hear this. This is great. This is what I would have said to them, you know? And so I'm genuinely optimistic about this, at least in the abstract. Now, like I said, when put into practice, I don't know if any of this is going to work. It might all be terrible. Who knows? Blah, blah, blah. I also like that armor becomes damaged. They say, yeah, there's a new system governing armor degradation. Great, because the quality of weaponry definitely goes down in a battle. People break their spears, they break their shields, they break their, you know, the actual armor they're wearing. Although that seems to have been less of a thing that people report. Really, it's the shield and the weapon that gets broken. But that's fine, you know, just, you know, an abstract sort of armor has gone down to show the fighting efficiency of the unit as impaired. Perfect. Totally fine with it. You know, it's totally fine. It's a good idea as well, because that way you have a reason. I mean, like at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans were apparently reduced to fighting with their teeth and nails at points, you know, so that's good. You know, equipment degradation, even if it's only armor degradation, is a nice touch. And that's the sort of thing that we want. And so that's all good, right? These are actually really good ideas that apparently are going to be present in Pharaoh Total War. And so I'm optimistic that in, like, you know, a year or two's time, there might be an Assyria Total War that actually is more representative of ancient warfare and is, you know, like a mod. You know, someone's going to mod this, hopefully, to make an Assyria Total War. Fingers crossed. Come on. You know you want this, right? But even then, on the face of it, this is a good start. And I haven't played Troy Total War, but Josh at work has, and he was saying how it's got a much more different resource management system. So you've got 3 resources rather than just money now. And that's a great idea. Why not have a resource management system in Total War? I think that sounds brilliant, right? And so he said he much preferred the resource management. So if we can go back to sort of Rome-style building with the sort of Troy Total War resource management, and these improvements, as if they play out as we are being promised that they'll play out, then actually I'm kind of excited for that. That would be great, actually. Like I said, I don't know anything really about Pharaoh yet because obviously nothing's come out, and no, I'm not pre-ordering it. I'm going to wait to see someone else playing it, frankly, because I've been burned before. I pre-ordered Rome 2. I'm not doing it again. Who knows how Siege is going to be. Hopefully they're not like the Warhammer Total War Sieges, which were just awful. Again, Sieges were perfectly fine in every other Rome game or Total War game, and then suddenly it's like, well, you get one wall to assault. It's like, oh, come on. You know, come on. That's not fun, is it? I don't know about the victory points, to be honest. But I don't, you know, I'm not that picky about the Sieges, to be honest. For me, it's the field battles need to be improved. But anyway, these were just my thoughts on Pharaoh Total War. Before I've seen anything, I've not seen any gameplay footage, I've not seen anyone operating the campaign map, and this is an advert, so they may be just lying, or they may be just totally... I don't think they are. I'm sure that they are going to have some kind of mechanisms for this in the game, but whether they're actually put into practice in the way that I think they should be, who knows, right? I've no idea. It might all be terrible. But at least these are good ideas, and from a historical military perspective, it would be really desirable to have all of these in Total War. Anyway, I'll leave links in the description to my Twitch, where I play Total War often, to my Discord, where it's just a gaming Discord, and to my Subscribe Star, because of course YouTube demonetized this channel, because apparently I'm not allowed to talk about video games on YouTube. If I do, I get punished. So if you want to support just me, for whatever reason, doing these things, you can do that. Thanks for watching, folks. I'll see you next time.